Wondering which material to use when you're propagating your plants? You're not alone. I get that question a lot. And unfortunately, the answer is, it depends. There are a lot of choices. But do not worry. In today's video, I'm going to break down the 5 most common substrates to use when propagating your houseplants. I'll talk about the pros and the cons, how to use each one, and which plants will benefit from which material. Welcome to my channel. I'm Cece with One Green Pea. I'm here to educate and inspire you on your plant journey. If you have any questions after watching the video, leave them down in the comments below. And don't forget to give a little love tap to that heart to show me that you enjoyed this content. There are a lot of choices when it comes to a medium to use when propagating your plants. A good medium allows for aeration for the roots, but also holds on to moisture. Each of the 5 methods I talk about today have varying characteristics, and so we're going to provide different amounts of both aeration and moisture holding. So really it's important to decide what plant you are propagating, and then that will help you pick the best medium for it. The goal of propagation is to get your plant to root before it rots or dries out and desiccates. Let's start with the simplest and most common method, and that is rooting cuttings in water. Most plants will root in water, and the roots are visible. Water is widely available, and all you need is a propagation vessel. One of the negatives of rooting in water is that the roots that form tend to be adapted to water, and that can cause a little bit of a challenge when you're transferring your cuttings into soil or whatever you're going to be growing them in for the future. Generally, I haven't had a terrific amount of problem with that, especially because I don't leave them in the water for a super long time. I try to transfer my cuttings to soil once the roots are about 2 to 3 inches long. I feel like at that point they are well grown and yet not overly dependent on that wet environment. Now, some plants do take longer to root in water and prefer to be rooted in other methods. The ZZ plant is one of those. This plant has a rather woody stem and actually does better in other substrates that I will talk about later. I rooted this one in water just for ease, and it has developed some roots. These ZZ cuttings, on the other hand, I have had in water, I'm not exaggerating, for 2 years. I have the tiniest development of roots now. I enjoy seeing these cuttings in this jar. I think it's a beautiful sculptural arrangement, but if I'm actually interested in creating a new plant, I would be best off moving these cuttings into another substrate. Another method that is very simple is rooting cuttings directly in soil. This works best for plants that are able to maintain their own moisture level until they root. That would be like succulents like this dragon tail, or something with a woody stem and thick waxy leaves like a ZZ plant. It also works well for plants that root very quickly. I have a Monstera adansonii that I wanted to fill out, so I took cuttings from the vines and just placed those cuttings right into the exact same pot. Those root rather quickly, and so I was pretty certain that I would have a fair amount of success by doing it with that method, rather than moving them into water and then possibly having some transfer shock when I moved those vines back into the soil mix. Not every plant will root that way, so you kind of have to be a little bit careful about that, but for the ones that do, it's just absolutely the simplest way. A substrate that I've only started to use in propagating my plants is perlite. I have used perlite for a long time in my soil mixes to provide aeration, but I've only begun using it as a propagation substrate, and I really, really like it. Now, perlite is that white substance that you see in your soil mixes that kind of looks like styrofoam. It's actually puffed volcanic glass. It holds its shape in the soil, it doesn't break down, and it provides a really nice level of aeration, which is why it's commonly seen in soil mixes. As far as a substrate for propagating, it also holds moisture. To use perlite as a propagation substrate, you would take a bowl of perlite, wet it, place some of it at the bottom of your vessel, push your cuttings into that, and then backfill. So put more wet perlite on top of that. You want the perlite to be wet, but you don't want water visibly at the bottom. So you kind of have to monitor the level, sticking your finger in, making sure that it's maintaining some moisture. I put these in about a week ago, and I'm seeing a little bit of growth here along those nodes. So I think it's successful, and it's really, really easy, and it looks kind of cool. Perlite is going to be a good substrate for a woody stemmed plant that you're concerned might rot in straight water. And the roots they're going to develop are going to be very easily transferred to a soil mix if that's what you choose to grow your plant in. It can be a little messy to use. That's why you really want to wet it down before you work it so that it's not flying all over the place and getting in your nose. But really a very valid propagation method that I'm probably going to use more often. The next substrate is LECA. Now LECA are clay balls. When you wet them, they hold moisture for sometimes weeks at a time. Because of their size and structure, they create a lot of aeration. Like perlite, a plant that you'd be concerned might rot in water would do really well in LECA. I'm going to show you how to use it using this cutting that I took from my peperomia. It has a nice woody stem. I don't necessarily want this to be in water for weeks at a time, but I think it will do really well in the LECA. I have already wet this LECA. I'm going to place it, a layer of it in my jar. I'm going to remove these two lower leaves so I have more to work with on the stem. Then I'm going to just place it down into the jar and then fill it with more LECA. It does provide some nice support for your woody stemmed plants so they stay upright. And then what I'm going to do is fill this to a couple of inches from the bottom of the jar with water. And that's going to keep the LECA wet. That will be wicked up by the exposed nodes on my peperomia stem. It's a nice clean method, and I think it looks kind of cool as well. The final method I want to talk about today is sphagnum moss. I've talked before about how I am really not a fan of using sphagnum moss, and that is primarily because of the environmental sustainability problems. We are doing a lot of damage as we harvest sphagnum moss, and so I'm not buying it anymore. I'm really just using up what I've already purchased. It does create a rather nice environment for propagating plants. So I'm going to show you how I do that. I have wet this sphagnum moss, so I'm going to take some out of my bag. I'm going to lay it in this just plastic takeout container. Sphagnum moss does hold moisture very, very nicely, which is one of the benefits. And in using a propagation box like this, I can put the lid on, and that is going to hold humidity in, which is generally a boon for anything that you are trying to propagate. Now, this method works well, especially for vining plants. I have a couple of cuttings from a syndapsis that I had in water, and several of them grew very well in the water. These were not growing so well, so I thought I would try a different method. So I'm going to take my cutting and just lay it down horizontally on the moss. I want to be certain that my nodes are in contact with the sphagnum moss, because that's how they're going to get their moisture. And so I can always add just a little bit more moss. I don't want to cover them up completely, but I just want to be sure that the nodes are in contact with the moist moss. Moss does hold moisture for a long time, but I generally will check it every 3 or 4 days and make sure that it's still moist. I just put the lid on. I don't have to seal it. Just place it on like that. That's going to hold some humidity in there. And then very likely these are going to root at many nodes, so multiple nodes. And that's one of the benefits of using this method rather than an upright stem. I'm going to get a lot of usable roots that I can then place into a pot. So that's why it works best for a vining plant. Like I said at the beginning, I'm not a big fan of this, but if you have some sphagnum moss, it's worthwhile to use it in this manner. A couple of last tips as far as propagation methods go. My first is, if one method is not working, try something else. That is exactly what I did with these Syndapsis cuttings. Some of them rooted really well in water, and for some unknown reasons, others didn't. So I'll move them to another substrate and see if that works better. The second tip is keep in mind that you want to have your cuttings in bright light, but not direct light. You definitely don't want to have freshly rooting cuttings in a direct window, direct light, but also don't keep them in a dark corner. So bright, indirect light. You also want to keep moisture to the roots. That's why you're going to use many of these methods that are wet substrates. And even with just planting a plant right in soil, I tend to try to keep the soil just a little bit moister than I generally do when the plant is fully grown. And the final tip is humidity. If you have a plant that is not rooting well, try to add some humidity. So take a plastic bag and put it over top of your jar or whatever you are using, or like this one, placing a lid on top of it tends to help increase humidity, and that just prompts root growth. So be experimental, have some fun, and don't stress so much about it. You can always take more cuttings of your plants. Thank you for watching my video. I hope that it was helpful to you. And like I said at the beginning, if you have questions, leave them down in the comments below. Remember to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel so you never miss any planty content. As always, my plant friends, let's keep growing together a greener world.